Imagine a world where half the population's ideas, dreams, and wisdom were rarely heard beyond the walls of their homes. A world where their insights, their concerns, and their very existence in public life seemed to vanish like smoke in the wind. What if this wasn't just a grim story from a forgotten past, but a stark reality for women in the year 640 AD? What does it truly mean to be silenced? And how did an entire society make sure that countless voices remained unheard in public life during that distant era? Number 1. The echo of disapproval in the year 640 and nascent kingdoms, from the sprawling Byzantine territories to the emergent Islamic caliphates and the fragmented lands of Western Europe. Women who dared to speak out to challenge the established order or to assert an intense wave of disapproval, an echo of an intense wave of disapproval, an echo of satanic alarms that reverberated. This was not a system based on simple rules written in a book, but an unspoken, deeply ingrained cultural understanding that public expression from women was often an act of defiance, inviting a range of severe repercussions that served as powerful deterrents. The very threat of these outcomes was enough to mute many, keeping their thoughts and opinions locked away, private and unheard. Consider, for a moment, the concept of honor, a cornerstone in many societies of the 7th century. For women, their honor, and by extension the honor of their family, was inextricably linked to their perceived modesty, their adherence to social conventions, and their restraint in public interactions. A woman who spoke too loudly, who voiced opinions deemed too strong or too independent, or who engaged in public discourse, might be seen as transgressing these delicate boundaries. In the Byzantine Empire, for instance, a woman who appeared too often in public or who was perceived as too assertive could find her reputation and that of her entire family severely tarnished. This was not a small matter. A damaged reputation could lead to social ostracism, making it incredibly difficult to arrange favorable marriages for daughters, to secure alliances, or even to conduct basic transactions within the community. The threat of this social fallout was a powerful muzzle, ensuring that most women chose the path of silence rather than risk the intricate web of societal disapproval. They understood, often instinctively, that their words, if spoken in public, could become a weapon turned against them, eroding their standing and the standing of those they loved. Furthermore, economic dependence played a crucial role in reinforcing this silence. While some women, particularly from wealthy aristocratic families, might possess some form of inherited property or dowry, the vast majority were reliant on male relatives, fathers, husbands, brothers, for their livelihood and security. This economic vulnerability meant that challenging the patriarchal structure of society or speaking out against prevailing norms could jeopardize their very survival. Imagine a woman in a Germanic kingdom, perhaps a widow trying to manage a small plot of land. If she were to speak out against a local chieftain's decree or voice an opinion contrary to the community's male elders, she might find herself denied access to communal resources, protection, or vital assistance during harsh winters. Her economic lifeline could be severed, leaving her and any dependents destitute. The knowledge that dissent could lead to destitution was a profound force, pushing women towards conformity and quietude. Their voices were tied to their economic security, and when that security was tenuous, silence became a rational choice for survival. The legal systems of the time, though varied, often reinforced these punitive social norms. In many regions, the legal standing of women was significantly lower than that of men. Their testimony in court might be valued less or not at all. This meant that if a woman were to be slandered or faced social repercussions for her words, her avenues for legal recourse were limited. In some parts of the early Islamic world, while women had certain rights concerning property and divorce, their public testimony in legal matters was often given less weight than a man's, sometimes requiring 2 female witnesses to equal 1 male witness. This disparity extended beyond the courtroom, subtly signaling that a woman's word, particularly in public forums, carried less inherent authority. If your words are less credible in the eyes of the law, why would you risk speaking them in the face of widespread disapproval? The justice system, rather than being a shield for their voices, often mirrored the societal biases that sought to diminish them. Beyond formal legal structures, the threat of physical violence or ostracization was a very real, though often unspoken, consequence for women who transgressed social boundaries. While explicit laws punishing public speech from women were rare in some places, the informal enforcement of social norms could be brutal. A woman deemed unruly or immodest for her public outspokenness might face domestic violence, abandonment, or even community shunning. In the fractured societies of Western Europe, still grappling with the aftermath of the Roman Empire's decline, local customs and the authority of individual male heads of households often held sway. A husband or father who felt his family's honor had been compromised by a woman's public behavior might resort to severe measures to restore order and reputation. Measures that could include physical abuse or confinement. The fear of such retaliation, a fear deeply ingrained through generations of observation and tradition, served as a powerful inhibitor, pushing women to retreat from public visibility and public expression. Even when women did possess a degree of informal influence, often through their connections to powerful men, this influence was typically exercised through private channels. A queen or an empress might exert considerable power behind the scenes, advising her husband or son, but she would rarely, if ever, stand in an assembly and publicly debate policy. When historical records mention women acting in powerful capacities, it is almost always within the confines of private councils, or through intermediaries. Publicly, their voice was that of their male proxy, a filtered and often diluted version of their original intent. If a woman of high standing, such as a Byzantine empress, were to openly challenge the patriarch or the Senate in a public forum, it would be seen as an act of astounding defiance, likely to be met with fierce condemnation and accusations of stepping outside her proper sphere. The very act of public speaking for women, especially on matters of state or public policy, was seen as inherently transgressive, a violation of the natural order as understood in 640, and the risk was too high, the backlash too severe. This systemic threat of disapproval extended even to creative or intellectual pursuits if they stepped outside the accepted domestic sphere. While some women might have been skilled artisans or poets, within their homes or private circles, public exhibition or widespread dissemination of their work under their own name was rare. Their artistic voices were often absorbed into the collective or attributed to male patrons or family members. A woman who sought to publish her writings or perform her music in a public setting would likely be met with scorn, accusations of impropriety, and a swift societal rebuke. The expectation was that women's creative contributions, if any, should remain private for the enjoyment of family and close friends, not for the public sphere. To seek public recognition was to invite the strong and echoing disapproval of a society that valued female humility and discretion above all else. This societal pressure created a self-censoring mechanism where women, knowing the potential cost, chose to keep their talents hidden, their voices quiet, their ideas unspoken, rather than face the inevitable and overwhelming echo of disapproval that would surely follow. The very absence of their public voices in historical accounts serves as a testament to the powerful effectiveness of this pervasive societal mechanism of silencing. Number 2. The halls of power barred doors. Imagine trying to influence decisions that shape your entire society, but every door leading to the place where those decisions are made is locked shut with no key in sight. This was the stark reality for women in 640 AD when it came to political representation. Across virtually every major civilization of the time, the halls of power, whether they were imperial courts, tribal councils, or emerging proto-parliaments, were almost exclusively male domains. Women were systematically excluded from formal political participation, from holding elected offices, from serving as official advisors in public bodies, and from participating in assemblies that debated laws, levied taxes, or declared war. Their voices, therefore, were entirely absent from the most crucial public discussions that determined the fate of empires and individuals. This exclusion was not merely an oversight, it was a deeply ingrained principle, a cornerstone of the patriarchal structures that defined political life in the 7th century. In the mighty Byzantine Empire, for example, the emperor was the supreme authority, often advised by a council of high-ranking male officials, senators, and military commanders. While an empress might wield significant informal influence behind the scenes, especially if she was a strong personality or the mother of a young emperor, her power was almost never formally recognized in public political structures. She would not sit in the Senate, she would not chair public meetings, and her decrees would not be issued under her own name as a sovereign ruler unless she was a regent acting for a minor son. Her voice in the public policy discussions was always mediated, filtered through the male figures who held formal power. The court chroniclers, who meticulously documented the political life of the empire, rarely, if ever, recorded a woman speaking in a formal public political capacity. Their political insights, their diplomatic skills, if they possessed them, were confined to private chambers, whispers in the emperor's ear, or secret negotiations conducted through trusted male intermediaries. The formal mechanisms of power were simply not designed to include them, and any attempt to cross that threshold would have been seen as a grave violation of tradition and order. Journeying west to the Germanic kingdoms that were solidifying after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the situation was no different, and perhaps even more pronounced in its exclusion. These societies often operated on tribal or kinship structures, with decision-making power resting with male elders, chieftains, and warriors. Assemblies, when they occurred, were gatherings of armed men, where issues of war, land distribution, and justice were debated and decided. Women were entirely absent from these forums. Their role was seen as domestic, focused on the household child-rearing and the production of goods necessary for family survival, while a powerful queen, such as Brunhild of Austrasia, might exert immense influence through marriage and dynastic struggles. Her power derived from her male connections and was often contested, precisely because she operated outside the perceived natural bounds of female authority. She was an anomaly, and her ability to wield power was often met with resistance and accusations of unnatural ambition rather than seen as a legitimate form of political participation. The very thought of a woman standing in a war council or a legal assembly to voice her opinion would have been considered absurd, even offensive. In the emerging Islamic societies of the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, the nascent political structures were also overwhelmingly male-dominated. The early caliphs, leaders of the Muslim community, made decisions with the council of prominent male companions and tribal leaders. While women played crucial roles in the early development of Islam, often contributing through their piety, scholarship, or as transmitters of tradition, their direct participation in the formal political governance was virtually non-existent. There is no historical record of women serving as official members of the Shura, consultative council, or holding formal administrative positions within the nascent caliphate. Even significant figures like Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, whose influence was immense in religious and social matters, did not formally participate in the political leadership or decision-making bodies of the caliphate in the way that male companions did. Her public actions, such as her involvement in the Battle of the Camel, were often met with controversy and considered exceptional and somewhat atypical for a woman's public role. The expectation was that political leadership was a male prerogative, a responsibility tied to male authority and public sphere dominance. Even in societies like Tang Dynasty China, known for its relative openness in some aspects, women's political participation was severely constrained. While empresses, like the later Empress Wu Zetian, would indeed rise to unprecedented power, This was exceptional and often achieved through intense political maneuvering and breaking societal norms, not through standard political pathways open to men. In 640, the Tang bureaucracy was a vast meritocratic system, but it was almost entirely populated by men who had passed rigorous imperial examinations. Women were not permitted to take these examinations, nor were they allowed to hold formal government positions. Their influence, if any, was confined to the inner court, through connections to the emperor or other powerful male family members. The vast machinery of state administration, which governed millions of people, functioned without their direct input or formal representation. The concept of political representation, as understood in modern terms, simply did not exist for women in 640 ad twin. They were subjects, not active citizens, with a right to publicly voice their political opinions or to hold office. Their interests were assumed to be represented by their male guardians, fathers, or husbands. A legal code from the period, be it Byzantine, Germanic, or early Islamic, would delineate rights and responsibilities, but it would never include provisions for female participation in public governance or decision-making assemblies. The exclusion was so fundamental that it was rarely even explicitly debated. It was simply the accepted order of things, a foundational pillar of society. This systematic exclusion from formal political bodies meant that policies affecting women's lives, such as laws regarding marriage, inheritance, property, or even their daily conduct, were crafted and enacted without their direct input. Men decided what was best for women based on their own perceptions, religious interpretations, and societal norms. While individual women might try to influence these decisions through informal appeals or by leavened familial relationships, their voices were never present at the table where power was formally wielded. The public sphere of politics was designed to be an exclusively male arena, creating a vast and profound silence where women's political insights, experiences, and concerns should have been heard. The doors to the halls of power were not just closed. They were often invisible, unacknowledged, as even potentially accessible to women, effectively silencing them on matters of profound public importance. Number 3. The empty purse, the muted plea. Imagine wanting to stand up for yourself, to advocate for your family, or to contribute to your community, but realizing that your ability to do so is severely hampered by your complete lack of independent financial resources. In 640, for the vast majority of women across the known world, economic dependence was a pervasive reality, a powerful force that rendered their public voices muted, their pleas unheard, and their influence curtailed. The absence of economic autonomy meant that women often lacked the leverage, the freedom, and the sheer practical means to engage in public life, to express independent opinions, or to challenge the prevailing order. Their financial reliance on men, be it fathers, husbands, brothers, or other male guardians, created a profound vulnerability that served as a constant unspoken reminder to conform and remain quiet. Across the Byzantine Empire, early Islamic lands, and the various European kingdoms, women's economic activities were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They managed households, raised children, prepared food, and wove textiles. While these activities were undeniably vital for the survival and prosperity of the family unit, they rarely generated independent income or wealth that a woman could control and leverage in the public realm. While a wealthy, aristocratic woman might possess a dowry or inherit property, the management and legal control of such assets often remained under the guardianship of a male relative, or the assets were so tied to the family's overall economic structure that they did not provide true individual autonomy. For the vast majority of common women, there was no independent income, no personal savings, and no access to public markets or lucrative trades in their own right. Consider the life of a woman in a typical rural village in the Byzantine Empire during this period. Her days would be filled with labor, tending gardens, processing crops, caring for livestock, and weaving cloth for the family's clothes. Any surplus production would be managed and sold by her husband or father. She might participate in the labor, but the economic agency, the decision-making about what to sell, where to sell it, and how to use the proceeds, would almost always rest with the male head of the household. If she had a grievance with a neighbor or wished to advocate for a change in communal irrigation practices, her voice would carry little weight because she did not control the resources that underpinned the community's economic life. She could not offer to contribute financially to a communal project, nor could she threaten to withhold resources because she possessed none independently. Her plea, therefore, was often muted by her empty purse, her dependence on others to provide for her basic needs. In the early Islamic societies, while women were recognized as having certain rights to property and inheritance under Islamic law, the practical application of these rights often still placed women in a position of dependence. A woman might inherit land or money, but her husband was often responsible for managing it, and her social status and ability to engage in public life were still tied to her marital status and her husband's standing. Women were generally excluded from most public professions, such as trade over long distances, scholarship that required public teaching in mosques, or legal practice. While some women might have been skilled in crafts or specific trades, their economic sphere was often localized and domestic. To earn a living independently, a woman would have faced immense social obstacles and often legal restrictions that limited her ability to own businesses or participate in large-scale commerce. Without the means to accumulate wealth or generate an independent income, her ability to patronize public works, to fund charitable endeavors that would elevate her public profile, or to simply have the leisure time to engage in political or social discourse, was severely limited. The absence of economic independence also meant that women were often unable to leave situations of abuse or oppression. If a woman in a Germanic kingdom was mistreated by her husband, her options for escape were incredibly narrow. She could not simply pack her bags and set up a new household. As she had no independent means of support, her family might take her back. But even then, she would become a burden, and often her male relatives would have the final say in her future. The economic chains, though invisible, were incredibly strong, binding women to their social roles and making public protest, or even a simple expression of dissent, a perilous act. The fear of destitution, a constant companion for those without independent means, was a powerful motivator for silence and conformity. Furthermore, economic power often translated directly into political influence in 640. Land ownership, control over resources, and the ability to command labor were fundamental to asserting power and gaining a voice in public assemblies or councils. Since women rarely held these forms of economic power independently, they were effectively disbarred from the mechanisms of public influence. They could not raise armies, fund public projects, or sponsor religious institutions in their own name, actions that often conferred status and a platform for public expression. Their economic dependence ensured their political and social marginalization. Their voices were not heard in the public square because they lacked the economic leverage that allowed others to stand there and speak. Even in cases where women possessed some economic agency, such as a wealthy widow who inherited her husband's estates, the prevailing social norms often dictated that her public activities should be limited. She might manage her lands, but through male agents, or within the accepted boundaries of a woman's sphere. To step into the public economic arena too boldly, to conduct major business transactions in her own name, or to engage in public trade in a way typically reserved for men, would invite scrutiny and criticism. Her wealth, though technically her own, could not automatically translate into an uninhibited public voice without social repercussions. The expectation was that her economic activities, if any, should remain discreet, private, and managed through male intermediaries, further reinforcing the idea that women's economic lives, like their public voices, the empty purse, therefore, symbolized more than just a lack of money. It represented a fundamental lack of agency and freedom that permeated every aspect of a woman's public life in 640 AD. Without independent economic means, women lacked the ability to command respect in public forums, to fund their own endeavors, to escape oppressive situations, or to simply possess the leisure and resources required to engage in public discourse. Their dependence on male relatives for their very survival served as a constant, powerful reminder of their precarious position, forcing many to internalize silence as a necessary survival strategy. Their pleas, no matter how urgent, were often muted, lost in the echoing silence created by their profound economic vulnerability. Number 4. The veils in the courtyards. Imagine a world where your physical presence in public spaces is actively discouraged, where architectural design and social custom conspire to keep you confined, unseen, and unheard. In 640, across vast swaths of the known world, women's voices were silenced in public life, not just by law or by social norms, but by literal physical segregation and confinement. This was expressed through the wearing of veils, the design of homes with secluded courtyards, and the strict division of public and private spaces, all of which worked in concert to render women largely invisible and inaudible in the public sphere. Their physical absence from public forums directly translated into an absence of their voices, ideas, and perspectives in the communal discourse. Consider the Byzantine Empire, a Christian society with strong ties to Roman traditions. While veiling practices varied and were not as universal as in some later periods, there was a clear emphasis on modesty and the circumscribed public presence of women, especially those of good social standing. Women were expected to be accompanied by male relatives if they ventured out, and their movements in public spaces were often limited. The homes of the wealthy and even the moderately well-off were designed with internal courtyards, separating the domestic world from the public street. Women, particularly the more prominent ones, spent much of their lives within these private confines. When they did attend public events, such as religious services, they often sat in segregated sections of churches, sometimes behind screens or in elevated galleries, physically separated from the main male congregation. This physical separation minimized their public visibility and thus their opportunity to speak or be heard in public forums. Their public presence was not only diminished, but literally framed by physical barriers, reducing them to spectators rather than participants. In the emerging Islamic societies of the Arabian Peninsula, the concept of purdah, or the seclusion of women, began to take root, although its strictness evolved over centuries. In 640, and while not yet fully codified in all regions, the emphasis on modesty and the protection of women's honor meant that their interaction with non-familial men in public was limited. The use of veils and head coverings for women when outside the home became increasingly common, serving not only as a sign of piety and respectability, but also as a physical barrier that diminished their individual identity in public. When a woman's face is obscured, her individual expression, her reaction, her very presence as a distinct person in a public crowd is reduced. Furthermore, Islamic architecture often incorporated courtyards and separate women's quarters, ensuring that domestic life, the primary domain of women, was shielded from the public gaze. Markets and public gatherings were overwhelmingly male spaces. While women certainly visited markets, their interactions were often brief, focused on purchasing necessities, and designed to minimize prolonged public presence. This physical segregation meant that their voices were simply not part of the hustle and bustle of public life. They were relegated to the private, unseen realm of the home. Even in the more rural or tribal societies of Western Europe, the division between male and female spaces, though less formalized by architecture, was deeply ingrained in social custom. Men gathered in the communal hall or around a fire for discussions about hunting, warfare, and tribal affairs. Women's social interactions, while robust within their own circles, occurred predominantly within the confines of the family dwelling, the communal hearth, or during specific female-only gatherings. A woman would rarely, if ever, participate in a public meeting of warriors or elders. Their voices, therefore, were heard only within the intimate circle of family and close friends, never on the public stage where communal decisions were made. The very physical layout of their lives, the distinct spheres assigned to each gender, meant that women were literally kept out of the public spaces where voices could be heard, ideas debated, and influence exerted. Practical implications of this physical confinement were profound. If you are not present in the public square, you cannot speak in the public square. If you are not seen in the marketplace, your economic voice is diminished. If you are not in the communal hall, your opinions on tribal matters are irrelevant. This physical absence meant that women were often unaware of public discussions, decisions, or new developments until they were already established facts. They were not part of the initial debates, the conversations, or the negotiations that shaped their world. Their ability to react, to offer a counter-argument, or to express dissent was severely limited by their lack of physical presence in the spaces where these discussions took place. The veils in the courtyards became not just symbols of modesty or protection, but effective tools of silencing, ensuring that women's public visibility, and by extension their public voice, was diminished to the point of near invisibility. Furthermore, the very act of a woman appearing in a public space, especially without explicit male guardianship or in a way that defied the norms of modesty, could itself be seen as scandalous. This potential for social censure for being judged harshly acted as another deterrent, pushing women further into seclusion. The risk of being seen as immodest or unruly simply for being present in public was enough to keep many women confined to their homes. This created a vicious cycle. The less women were seen in public, the more unusual and suspect their public presence became, reinforcing the expectation of their confinement. Their absence became the norm, and the norm became the expectation. The effect of this physical segregation on women's public voice was cumulative and devastating. It limited their access to information, restricted their social networks beyond their immediate family, and denied them the informal opportunities for discussion and influence that men regularly enjoyed in taverns, forums, or marketplaces. The public sphere, the arena of debate, commerce, and political life, became a world from which women were largely excluded by design and custom. Their voices, therefore, never had the chance to resonate in these spaces. They were confined to the private realm, their words and ideas contained within the walls of their homes, effectively making them unheard, unacknowledged, and ultimately silenced in the broader public discourse of 640 AD. The veils and the courtyards were not just architectural or sartorial choices. They were powerful instruments of profound societal silencing. Number 5. The untouched scrolls. Imagine a world where knowledge is power, where the ability to read, write, and engage with complex texts is the key to understanding the world and shaping its future. Now imagine that for half the population, these keys are almost entirely out of reach. In 640, at one of the most pervasive ways women's voices were silenced in public life was through the systemic lack of formal education, particularly literacy. The vast majority of women across various cultures and empires were denied access to schools, libraries, and the scholarly pursuits that would have equipped them with the tools for public discourse, intellectual debate, and the articulation of their ideas in a way that commanded respect and attention. The untouched scrolls, the unread texts, and the unwritten treatises symbolized a profound absence of female intellectual contribution to the public sphere. Across the Byzantine Empire, formal education, particularly at higher levels, was largely the domain of men. While some elite women might have received private tutoring in literature, rhetoric, or the classics, This was an exception often intended to make them more suitable wives for educated men, rather than to prepare them for public intellectual engagement. The great schools of Constantinople or Alexandria were almost exclusively male. Boys from privileged families were taught grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and law, skills essential for careers in the imperial bureaucracy, the church, or legal professions, all overwhelmingly male public spheres. Women, conversely, were primarily educated in domestic skills, religious piety, and the management of a household. Their learning was focused on the private, not the public. This meant that even if a woman possessed keen intellect, she lacked the formal training, the Latin or Greek literacy, and the rhetorical skills that were prerequisites for participating in theological discates, legal arguments, or political discussions in the public forum. Her voice, however archival, would lack the authority and the polished expression that came from formal training. In the nascent Islamic world, while the Quran emphasized the importance of seeking knowledge for both men and women, the formal institutions of learning that emerged, such as the madrasas or centers of higher learning, were predominantly male spaces. Women certainly played crucial roles in the transmission of oral traditions, particularly hadith, sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, and some individual women became renowned scholars and jurists. However, these were often through informal apprenticeships or within scholarly family circles, not through widespread access to public education systems. For the average woman, literacy was uncommon, and access to formal written texts, particularly those dealing with law, theology, or philosophy, was limited. While they understood religious concepts, their ability to engage in nuanced public theological debate or legal discourse was severely hampered by the lack of formal, structured intellectual training and widespread literacy. Without the ability to read and interpret complex religious or legal texts independently, their voices in matters of public faith or law were often filtered through male scholars or imams. In the fragmented Germanic kingdoms of Western Europe, the level of literacy was generally much lower across the board even for men. Education was largely provided by the church or through private tutors for the aristocracy. However, what formal education existed was almost exclusively for boys, often intended to prepare them for clerical roles or as scribes for noble households. Girls, if they received any instruction beyond basic religious tenets, were taught domestic skills by their mothers or female relatives. The idea of a school for girls, where they would learn to read and write in Latin or their vernacular, was practically non-existent. This near-universal illiteracy among women meant that they could not engage with bidden laws, royal decrees, religious texts, or scholarly works. They could not write petitions, publish treatises, or engage in written correspondence that would allow their ideas to circulate beyond their immediate oral sphere. Their voices, therefore, could not contribute to the public intellectual life, or leave a lasting written record for future generations to consider. The untouched scrolls were silent witnesses to the knowledge they could not access. The consequences of this educational disparity were profound. Public life in 640, whether in the Byzantine courts, the early Islamic cities, or the nascent European kingdoms, relied heavily on written communication, legal texts, administrative records, and religious scriptures. Those who could read, write, and interpret these texts held immense power and influence. By systematically denying women access to these educational tools, society effectively denied them the ability to participate meaningfully in public discourse. How could a woman advocate for land rights if she could not read the legal charters? How could she engage in a theological debate if she could not access or interpret sacred texts? How could she influence political decisions if she could not understand the written decrees or communicate her ideas effectively in writing? Furthermore, the lack of formal education extended beyond mere literacy to the absence of training in rhetoric and public speaking. Men, particularly those destined for public roles, were often trained in the art of persuasion, the construction of arguments, and the confident delivery of speeches. These were skills vital for any form of public engagement. Women, on the other hand, were rarely, if ever, taught these skills. Their communication was expected to be gentle, deferential, and confined to private settings. This meant that even if a woman had an opportunity to speak in public, she might lack the training and confidence to articulate her thoughts effectively in a male-dominated public sphere that valued rhetorical prowess. Her voice might falter. Her arguments might be dismissed, not necessarily because of their content, but because of her lack of formal training in their delivery. The untouched scrolls, therefore, represent more than just a lack of access to books. They symbolize the broader societal exclusion of women from the intellectual foundations of public life. It was a silence born of a lack of tools, a deprivation of the very means to articulate, record, and transmit ideas beyond the ephemeral whisper of oral tradition. By keeping women largely illiterate and formally uneducated, the societies of 640 AD ensured that their potential contributions to law, philosophy, theology, and public policy remained unwritten, unread, and ultimately profoundly unheard in the public square. Number 6. The unwritten rulebook of respectability. Imagine a powerful, invisible force that dictates your every move, every word, and every public appearance. This force is not a law written in a statute book, but an unspoken, deeply internalized set of social norms and expectations, a pervasive, unwritten rulebook of respectability. In 640, this rulebook was a colossal barrier for women, ensuring their voices remained largely confined to the domestic sphere and silenced in public life. Concepts of honor, modesty, and chastity for women were so paramount that any perceived deviation from these ideals could lead to catastrophic social ruin, effectively deterring women from public expression that might be misconstrued or challenge these delicate boundaries. Across the Byzantine Empire, a woman's public reputation was inextricably linked to her perceived modesty and adherence to social decorum. A respectable woman was one who was seen infrequently in public, and when she was appropriately attired and accompanied. Conversations were expected to be demure, her laughter restrained, and her opinions, if any, expressed discreetly within private circles. To be loud, assertive, or to engage in public debate, particularly with men not of her immediate family, would have been seen as a breach of this unwritten code. Such behavior could lead to accusations of immodesty or even promiscuity, severely damaging her honor and, by extension, the honor of her entire family. This was not a minor inconvenience. A woman's reputation was her social currency. A tarnished reputation could prevent her from securing a good marriage, isolate her from respectable society, and even lead to her being ostracized. The immense pressure to maintain an impeccable reputation according to these narrow definitions often meant that silence and invisibility in public were the safest, most respectable choices. Their voices were silenced by the very weight of societal expectations. In the nascent Islamic communities, the concept of hayad, modesty and shyness, for women was highly valued. While women played significant roles in the early Islamic period, especially in transmitting religious knowledge, their public conduct was generally expected to be restrained and respectful of social boundaries. The emphasis on avoiding fitna, social disorder or temptation caused by women's public appearance or behavior, often led to customs that encouraged women to remain within the domestic sphere or to dress and behave in ways that minimized their visibility and interaction with unrelated men. For a woman to be seen speaking boldly or to engage in a public argument could easily be interpreted as a lack of hayed, bringing shame upon herself and her family. Unwritten rulebook of respectability, therefore, subtly guided women towards a public demeanor that was quiet, reserved, and largely passive, ensuring their voices were not heard in any assertive or independent capacity. The fear of being seen as disrespectful or unmodest was a powerful deterrent, forcing women to self-censor their public expressions. In the Germanic kingdoms of Western Europe, honor was a concept deeply intertwined with social status and family standing. For women, their honor was primarily tied to their chastity before marriage and their fidelity within it. While they participated in the daily life of the community, their roles were sharply delineated from men's. Public spaces, such as communal halls or battlefields, were overwhelmingly male domains where honor was demonstrated through martial prowess or political strength. A woman's public voice was not only unvalued, but often considered inappropriate. To speak out of turn, to challenge a man's authority in public, or to deviate from expected feminine behavior could lead to social ridicule or even accusations of witchcraft or defiance, which carried severe penalties. Pressure to conform to this gendered code of honor meant that women's voices were confined to private conversations, whispered advice or expressions within the domestic sphere, never reaching the public ear in a meaningful way. Their voice was not considered an asset in public, but potentially a liability to their honor. This unwritten rulebook also dictated which topics were appropriate for women to discuss and with whom. Matters of politics, warfare, law, or complex theology were generally considered beyond a woman's proper domain. Even if a woman possessed a keen understanding of these subjects, to voice her opinions on them in public would be seen as an act of stepping outside her prescribed role, an assertion of intellectual authority that violated the unwritten code of respectability. She would be deemed unwomanly, presumptuous, or worse. The fear of such social labeling was incredibly potent, serving as an invisible censor on women's public expression. They understood that their thoughts, however illogical, would be dismissed or scorned if spoken in the wrong context or by the wrong person, a woman. Furthermore, the unwritten rulebook often dictated that women should express their opinions through male intermediaries, their fathers, husbands, or brothers. A woman might advise her husband privately, but he would be the one to present the idea in a public forum. Her voice was not directly heard, but rather filtered and sanctioned by a male authority figure. This process ensured that any female influence was always mediated, never direct, and always subject to the interpretation and approval of men. It further reinforced the idea that women's direct public expression was not desirable or proper. Their words were only given public legitimacy when spoken by a man, effectively silencing their original voice. The cumulative effect of this unwritten rule book of respectability was a profound, chilling effect on women's public voices. It created an environment where conformity was rewarded and deviation was severely punished, not by formal laws, but by the relentless weight of social judgment and ostracization. Constant threat of having their reputation, their honor, or their very social standing undermined simply for speaking out or acting in a manner deemed unrespectable by societal norms meant that most women chose silence. They navigated their lives understanding that the safest path, the most esteemed path, was one of quiet compliance and invisibility in the public sphere. Their voices were thus muted, not by explicit decree, but by the pervasive and powerful societal pressure to conform to an unwritten rulebook that valued female silence and submission in public life above all else. Number 7. The sacred silence. Imagine a world where the very scriptures and interpretations of divine will, the bedrock of society's moral and social fabric, systematically placed women in a subordinate position, effectively muting their voices in religious, moral, and public discourse. In 640, dominant religious doctrines and their interpretations across various major civilizations played a profound role in silencing women's voices in public life. Whether it was the burgeoning interpretations of early Islamic texts, the established patristic writings of Christianity, or the enduring traditions of Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian Empire, Religious thought often underpinned social structures that confined women to the domestic sphere and limited their public expression, often justifying this through divine mandate. This was a silence rooted in the sacred, making any challenge to it seem not just socially transgressive, but spiritually rebellious. In the Christian Byzantine Empire, the teachings of the Church were pervasive, shaping almost every aspect of life. Patristic writings, the interpretations of early Church fathers, often emphasized the domestic role of women, viewing their primary purpose as wives and mothers. Figures like Paul the Apostle, whose epistles were widely read and interpreted, included verses that admonished women to learn in quietness and full submission and not to have authority over a man, nor to teach. While these passages were subject to various interpretations over centuries, in 640 AD, they were often understood in a way that discouraged women from public roles, particularly in religious teaching, preaching, or leadership within the Church. Women were generally excluded from the priesthood, from formal theological debate in public, and from preaching in churches. Their spiritual voices were primarily expressed through private prayer, personal piety, and sometimes through monastic life, but rarely in a public authoritative capacity. A woman who attempted to interpret Scripture publicly or preach would have been seen as challenging not just social order, but divine order, inviting severe condemnation from religious authorities. The sacred texts, as interpreted by the male hierarchy, effectively created a sacred silence for women in matters of public faith and teaching. In the nascent Islamic world, while the Quran granted women certain rights and acknowledged their spiritual equality before God, the developing interpretations of its verses and the Hadith, sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, often led to societal norms that limited women's public roles. While women, like Aisha, were prominent scholars and transmitters of hadith, and some women participated in battle, the growing emphasis on modesty, the protection of women's honor, and the idea of men as garputations of Quranic verses began to contribute to a separation of male and female spheres. Public religious leadership, such as leading prayers in mosques, delivering sermons, khutbah, or formally issuing religious rulings, fatwas, became almost exclusively the domain of men. While women could attend mosques, they often prayed in segregated areas, and their public participation in the discourse of the ulama, religious scholars, was not through public lectures or debates in central institutions, but through informal learning circles or through their influence on male scholars. The religious justifications, however nuanced, effectively placed women outside the public forum of religious authority and discourse, creating a profound sacred silence where their voices might otherwise have illuminating theological understanding. In the Sasanian Empire, which was the dominant power in Persia before the Islamic conquests, Zoroastrianism was the state religion. While historical records about women's exact roles in Zoroastrian public religious life in 640 AD are scarce, the general societal structure was patriarchal, and religious authority was vested in a male priestly class. Women's roles were primarily domestic, and there is no evidence of women holding formal religious leadership positions or participating in public rituals or debates in the same way as men. The sacred traditions and interpretations, passed down through generations, effectively carved out a predominantly male space for public religious expression and authority, limiting women's public spiritual voice to personal devotion or within the family unit. The sacred silence, enforced by religious interpretations, had far-reaching implications beyond just the church or mosque. Religion was woven into the very fabric of public life, influencing laws, social customs, and moral values. If women were deemed unsuitable for public religious leadership or teaching, this translated into an unspoken understanding that their voices were also less authoritative or appropriate in other public spheres, including legal, political, and social discussions. The religious justifications provided a powerful, divinely sanctioned basis for their public subordination. To challenge a woman's subordinate public role was not merely to defy tradition, it was to defy what was often presented as God's will. Moreover, religious institutions were often the primary custodians of literacy and formal education during this period. Since women were largely excluded from these institutions as students, scholars, or clerics, they were also excluded from the intellectual development and interpretation of religious texts. This meant that the doctrines and interpretations that shaped their roles were largely defined and promulgated by men without significant input from women's perspectives. The lack of their voices in the very process of religious interpretation perpetuated the cycle of silence, creating a self-reinforcing system where the sacred texts as understood and articulated by men continued to justify women's exclusion from public roles. The religious narratives of the time often presented archetypes of women that, while sometimes reverential, emphasized domesticity, piety, and submission rather than public assertion or leadership. Figures like Mary, the mother of Jesus in Christianity, or Khadijah, the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad in Islam, were revered, but their public roles were understood in a specific, often quiet and supportive context, not as models for widespread female public leadership or independent vocalization in public debates. These sacred narratives, though powerful in their inspiration, inadvertently contributed to the societal expectation that women's voices, particularly in public and authoritative religious contexts, should remain largely unheard, a sacred silence echoing through the institutions and practices of the time. Number 8. The walls around their words. Imagine a world where your ideas, no matter how brilliant, are confined to a whisper, where your opinions, no matter how encircled, rarely travel beyond the closest circle of your family. In 640, at one of the most fundamental ways women's voices were silenced in public life was through formal and informal legal restrictions. These barriers were not always codified in explicit, comprehensive legal documents, but they were deeply embedded in customary law, societal practice, and the very structure of the legal systems that governed daily life. These walls around women's words prevented them from participating in legal proceedings, owning property independently, entering into public contracts, or holding positions of authority, thereby fundamentally denying them the platforms and protections necessary for a public voice. Consider the Byzantine Empire, a sophisticated legal system that inherited much from Roman law. While Byzantine law was more advanced than many other contemporary systems, women's legal standing was still significantly constrained, especially concerning public life. For instance, women were generally excluded from serving as judges, lawyers, or public officials. Their ability to represent themselves in court, particularly in complex civil cases, was often limited, requiring a male guardian or representative to act on their behalf. This meant that their direct voice in legal disputes, which often had profound public and economic implications, was often filtered or entirely absent. Even when women owned property, especially if it was part of a dowry or inherited land, their husbands or male guardians often retained significant control over its management and disposition. This diminished legal control over assets meant that women lacked the economic leverage that men could use to exert influence in public life, to fund ventures, or to participate in public commerce. Their legal standing, in essence, erected a barrier around their words, preventing them from being heard in the very arenas where legal and economic power intersected. In the Germanic kingdoms of Western Europe, the legal landscape was far more decentralized and based on customary law, often varying from region to region. However, a common thread was the legal subjugation of women to male authority. Women were typically under the mund, or guardianship, of a male relative, father, husband, or brother. This meant that women often could not enter into contracts, make sworn oaths in public, or represent themselves in tribal assemblies or legal gatherings without the consent or presence of their male guardian. Their testimony in court was frequently valued less than a man's, and in some instances not accepted at all. The very concept of a woman bringing a legal case or publicly advocating for a community interest in her own right was often alien to these legal systems. Disputes were settled by male elders, and women's roles were largely confined to being a subject of legal action, e.g., in cases of inheritance or marriage, rather than an active participant with an independent voice. The legal walls were thick, making it nearly impossible for a woman's public voice to penetrate the formal structures of justice and governance in the emerging Islamic societies. While Islamic law, Sharia, granted women specific rights concerning property, inheritance, and marriage, these rights were often interpreted and applied within a patriarchal social framework that still limited women's public legal roles. For example, in many legal interpretations, the testimony of a woman in court, particularly in criminal cases, was considered to be worth less than that of a man, often requiring 2 female witnesses to equal 1 male witness. While women could own property and engage in business, their public presence in the marketplaces and legal forums was often less prominent than men's. The role of the Qadi judge was exclusively male, and legal scholars, muftis, who issued opinions were predominantly men. This meant that while women had certain legal protections and rights, their direct voice in the public legal discourse, in the interpretation of laws, or in the administration of justice was effectively silenced. The legal system, though providing some protections, did not provide a platform for their public legal expression. Furthermore, these legal restrictions extended beyond formal courtrooms to everyday public interactions. The inability to independently enter into binding contracts, to conduct significant business transactions without male oversight, or to legally hold public office meant that women were largely excluded from the public economic and political spheres where voices were actively heard. If you cannot independently lease land, form a business partnership, or pledge allegiance in a legal sense, your voice in the associated public sphere is fundamentally absent. Your words lack legal weight, and therefore public consequence. The legal frameworks of 640 AD also generally did not recognize women as heads of households in the same public capacity as men, even if they were widows or single. While they might manage a household, their legal and public representation in matters relating to that household's communal affairs would typically fall to a male relative or a designated male guardian. This meant that, even in matters directly impacting their family or community, their voice was mediated through a male or simply unheard in public assemblies or decision-making bodies. These legal walls around women's words were not merely theoretical. They had tangible consequences for their daily lives and their ability to assert themselves in the public sphere. They created a system where women's opinions, arguments, and protests, if voiced publicly, carried little legal authority or weight. The very structure of legal systems, which dictated who could speak, who could testify, and whose word counted in the public domain, systematically excluded women from having a significant independent public voice. These were not just social customs. They were foundational legal principles that ensured women's voices were confined, unheard, and ultimately silenced within the public life of 640 AD.